Be useful for something, Emma. That's what her father said, without looking her in the eyes, before selling her in a deal that reeked of desperation and betrayal. In a single night, the young overweight woman saw her life change forever. From devoted and dreamy daughter, she became the currency used to pay a debt to the Mafia. Her destiny? To be forced into marriage with Alexander Moretti, a cold, powerful, and feared millionaire, owner of an empire that controlled half the city. Everyone said he knew no mercy. But there was something in that gaze that no one could decipher, something hidden behind the silence and shadow. Emma believed she was being handed over to a monster, but what she didn't know is that the real secret was about to be revealed, and it would change everything. Emma grew up hearing that life wasn't made for people like her. From a young age, she learned that the world could be cruel to those born in a poor neighborhood and carry the weight of others' stares on their body. The young overweight woman worked from early on to help her sick mother, cleaning houses and washing clothes until her hands cracked. Her father, a bitter man dominated by gambling addiction, saw in her not a daughter, but a way out of his own failures. He promised himself he would solve everything, but when the debt to the Moretti family came knocking, desperation spoke louder. That night was different. The air felt heavy and the silence cut to the chest like a blade. Emma heard muffled laughter, firm footsteps, and a name that would change her destiny: Alexander Moretti. The deal was made without tears or forgiveness, and she became the price of a broken promise. The next day, life went on, but nothing seemed the same. The sun rose without brightness, and the smell of coffee, once comforting, now brought bitter memories. Her mother, frail and trembling, tried to hide the fear behind a smile that convinced no one. Emma felt her heart tighten every time she saw her father avoid her gaze, aware of what he had done. In the streets, the neighbors whispered and said she was lucky. After all, she was going to marry a rich man. But what kind of luck is that when love isn't a choice but punishment? While folding sheets and pretending normalcy, she thought about the exciting stories she read in old magazines left in her employer's living room, where ordinary women found courage in the midst of pain. Maybe it was just fiction, but Emma dreamed of being one of those women. Someone who didn't break, even when forced to bend. When the wedding dress arrived, carefully hung on a worn hanger, Emma stared at it like someone stares at a sentence. The white fabric, delicately embroidered, seemed to mock the simple life she led. Her hands trembled as she touched the cold cloth, imagining what awaited her on the other side of that arranged marriage. Still inside her, a voice stubbornly whispered that hope doesn't die. It just hides. Her father, silent, avoided being around, perhaps tormented by guilt, perhaps relieved to have gotten rid of the debt. Her mother prayed every night, asking for a miracle, and Emma, alone in her room, looked out the window and wondered if destiny could be rewritten. Little did she know that the man she would be handed over to wasn't what he appeared to be, and that a dark secret was about to change everything. The wedding day arrived like punishment disguised as a party. The simple hall of the neighborhood church was hastily decorated, with cheap flowers and candles that burned slowly, as if they too pitied the bride. Emma walked down the aisle with a heavy heart, her gaze lost among unfamiliar faces and malicious whispers. Some murmured about her appearance, others about the power of the man waiting for her at the altar. Alexander Moretti was there, impeccable in his black suit, his expression firm and distant, like someone signing a contract, not like someone getting married. No smile, no words, just a cold nod when the priest began the ceremony. The ring slipped onto her finger like a golden chain, sealing the destiny she had never chosen. And, in that instant, Emma understood the weight of being used as currency. The world seemed to collapse, and the sound of applause sounded more like a sentence than a celebration. The wedding night was an uncomfortable silence. Alexander, true to his reputation as a ruthless man, merely instructed the servants about the house rules and withdrew, without even looking at his wife. Her room was huge, but empty of meaning. The luxury around contrasted with the cold that dominated the environment. Emma sat on the edge of the bed and cried softly, so no one would hear. There was no love, no promise, just a deal, and the certainty that she now belonged to a world that wasn't hers. The next day, she walked through the mansion with timid steps, feeling the judgmental stares of the servants, who whispered between contained laughter. "The new Mrs. Moretti," they said with irony. Each word was a wound, but she learned to swallow the pain in silence. After all, she already knew that tears didn't change anything. They only left the soul more tired. In the days that followed, loneliness became routine. Alexander was rarely home, and when he acted as if Emma were invisible. There was in her a mix of fear and curiosity. Fear of the man everyone feared, and curiosity about that distant gaze that had something beyond coldness. She remembered the real stories she read about arranged marriages, but none seemed as bitter as what she was living now. Still, there was something in Emma that destiny couldn't break. The ability to resist. She cared for the garden flowers, talked with the humblest servants, and wrote small prayers in an old notebook, like someone trying to keep their own faith alive. Deep down, she believed that no one could be cold forever. And, even without knowing it, that hardened heart sleeping under the same roof was slowly beginning to notice her presence. In the first days, Emma believed that silence would be her shelter. But she soon discovered that in that house, silence also hurt. The servants watched her with disguised contempt, laughing in secret when she passed through the hallways. Each laugh was an invisible stab, and each piercing look reminded her of the place they said was hers, that of the woman who didn't belong there. The luxurious clothes left on the bed seemed to mock her curves, and the expensive dresses became instruments of torture when the seamstresses whispered among themselves, saying it would be impossible to adjust them. Alexander, for his part, kept his distance. He played the role of husband only in front of others, but at home, he treated her like a ghost. Sometimes, Emma heard him talking on the phone in a low voice, always at night, always locked in the study. And although she didn't understand the words, she felt in the air that something dark was being hidden. Meals were the worst time. The long mahogany table, lit by candelabras, seemed like a courtroom. Alexander ate in silence, the silverware echoing like a judge's gavel, while the servant stares judged her without mercy. "Eat slowly, Mrs. Moretti," said one of the women with a fake smile, knowing that everyone watched every movement of the young overweight woman, waiting for a failure, a slip, a shame. And when she dropped her fork, smiles spread across the table like poison. Still, Emma took a deep breath and raised her head, determined not to let herself be broken. In each veiled insult, she found a silent lesson about resistance. She learned to respond with dignity, even when her heart begged to run away. And it was there, amid the humiliations, that something began to change. Inside her, being born like a spark ready to become fire. One morning, Emma got up before sunrise and went to the garden. She sat on the cold grass and looked at the sky, wondering why God had placed her in that place. And, for the first time, she didn't cry. She felt that, somehow, there was a purpose hidden behind that pain. She began to treat the servants with kindness, even those who despised her. She helped with household chores, talked with the gardeners, and even cooked alongside the cooks, bringing a warmth that hadn't been felt there in a long time. Gradually, the heavy atmosphere began to change. Some servants began to respect her, admiring her silent courage. Alexander, watching from afar, pretended indifference, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. Emma didn't know it yet, but that change, small, almost imperceptible, would be the first step in touching the heart of a man who hadn't believed in anything for years. Time began to reveal what silence hid. Emma noticed that Alexander wasn't just a cold and ruthless man everyone feared. There was something more there, something that escaped the surface. He disappeared for hours, sometimes for days, without explaining where he went. And when he returned, he brought in his eyes a tiredness that the mansion's luxury couldn't hide. At the table, he spoke little, and when he spoke, the words came measured as if weighed before being said. The mansion had dozens of doors, but one in particular caught attention, a locked door at the end of the main hallway. No servant approached it. Emma tried to disguise her curiosity, but it was impossible to ignore the mystery that hung in the air. At night, she heard footsteps, muffled voices, and the sound of metal hitting, as if someone were working in secret. It was like living in a place where every wall kept a secret, and every secret seemed to breathe. One early morning, sleep didn't come. Emma got up, put on her slippers, and went to the hallway. The silence of the house was so deep that she could hear her own heart. That's when she noticed a light on under the locked door. She took a few steps, hesitated, and put her ear to it. Voices. Two. One was Alexander's, the other unknown. They're getting suspicious. We need to act soon, said her husband, in a tone that mixed urgency and fear. Before she could hear more, the light went out. The sound of the key turning made her body freeze. She ran back to her room, her heart racing, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. The next day, she pretended normalcy, but doubt hammered her mind. Why did such a powerful man seem to live hiding something? And who were they? Each gesture of his, each silent look, now carried a new meaning. Curiosity became restlessness, and restlessness, a strange kind of empathy. Emma, accustomed to carrying labels and judgments, saw in Alexander reflection, someone who also lived imprisoned by their own shadows. She began to observe not just his secrets, but his pain. She realized he avoided contact with people, that he kept distance from everything and everyone, as if he feared getting attached. In small gestures, she tried to get closer. She left coffee on the table, cared for the garden flowers, wished good night with a sweet voice, even without a response. Gradually, the coldness of the house began to dissolve, and the man who never smiled began to watch her from afar, in silence. There was something different in his gaze, a kind of respect, maybe even admiration. Emma still didn't understand why, but she felt, deep in her soul, that she was about to discover something that would change everything she knew about him and about herself. Emma began to realize that courage didn't need to be loud. She discovered that small, discreet acts could transform entire environments. She began to approach the servants, offering help with daily tasks and listening to their stories, their complaints, and their fears. The heavy atmosphere of the mansion, once suffocating, began to change, little by little, like a gentle breeze entering through open windows. The young overweight woman felt that, somehow, her presence brought comfort, even if no one said it out loud. At night, she wrote letters to her mother, took care of medicines from a distance, and, despite the tiredness, didn't give up believing she could make a difference. Alexander began to notice the change. It wasn't just kindness. It was a silent strength that disarmed the coldness of the place. He watched in silence, each gesture of hers, each contained smile, and something inside him began to awaken, something he hadn't felt in years. Each small act of Emma seemed to challenge the logic of the house. She helped cooks prepare dinner, talked with gardeners, cheered up sad servants, and even made subtle jokes to break the climate of fear. Her presence provoked looks, shy smiles, and gradually respect. Alexander watched everything without showing anything, but internally something was changing. He would never admit it, but he saw in her a strength that didn't bend, an empathy that he himself had lost long ago. The young overweight woman carried with her a rare dignity, even in the face of contempt. And while she transformed the environment with patience and heart, Alexander began to realize that this forced marriage could be more than a contract. Perhaps it was the beginning of something impossible to ignore, even for him. And it was in this climate of small silent revolutions that the unlikely began to happen. Emma discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. She cared for the mansion with attention, remembered details forgotten by the servants, and began to create true bonds. Alexander, no matter how much he pretended indifference, couldn't ignore her determination. He watched hidden, the way she dealt with problems, her patience in the face of insults, and the kindness she radiated. Gradually, he began to approach, first in discreet gestures, then with light words, almost imperceptible. The mansion, once cold and oppressive, began to feel warmth, and in the middle of that silent transformation, a question arose. To what extent could a heart open up to someone who seemed impossible to love? One night, Emma was alone in the mansion's library, flipping through books she barely understood, when something fell from a shelf, a thick folder with yellowed papers and secret documents. Curiosity overcame fear, and she began to read. What she found left her breathless. Alexander wasn't just a mafia boss everyone feared. He was undercover. His goal wasn't to accumulate power, but to bring down the very criminal empire from within. Each page revealed plans, strategies, secret contacts, and risks she could barely comprehend. The man who seemed distant and cold, who ignored her presence and mocked her insecurities, was risking his own life to fulfill a dangerous and complex mission. Adrenaline ran through her veins, and fear mixed with admiration. For the first time, Emma realized that behind the coldness existed real courage, almost impossible to measure. As she read, memories of Alexander's small gestures began to surface in her mind, details that before seemed insignificant, but now made sense. That discreet attention he showed, the mysterious decisions, and the secret exits from the mansion weren't signs of indifference or cruelty, but of care and strategy. Each action of his had a greater purpose, and Emma began to understand that her life, so full of contempt and humiliation, was now linked to something much bigger. She realized it wasn't just about a forced marriage, but an involuntary alliance with a man whose secret could save or destroy lives. The tension increased, because at the same time she felt admiration, she knew that any wrong move could put an end to both their safety. It was like walking on thin ice, where each step required courage and attention. Emma's heart beat faster as she perceived the magnitude of what she had discovered. She felt powerless before the complexity of Alexander's plan, but also powerful for having access to a truth no one else knew. Each document read was proof that appearances deceive, and that secrets carry more weight than imagined. The young, overweight woman understood that this man, who seemed unreachable, was, in reality, as vulnerable as she was in many ways. The mixture of fear, empathy, and fascination began to create a silent connection between the two. Emma closed the folder, took a deep breath, and realized that from then on, nothing would be the same. She now knew that her courage could be the key to helping him, and that together, they could face something much bigger than simple contempt or wealth. Emma's discovery didn't remain secret for long. The Mafia, which Alexander was trying to bring down from within, began to perceive signs of betrayal. Intercepted messages, suspicious movements, and discontented allies pointed to something bigger than simple internal disputes. Suddenly, the house that was once a safe refuge became a labyrinth of suspicions and risks. Each door sound, each shadow in the hallway, seemed to announce imminent danger. Alexander finally confided, for the first time, the truth to Emma. "I accepted this marriage to protect you." His words fell on her like a storm, mixing fear and disbelief. The man everyone saw as cold and relentless now showed vulnerability, revealing that each distant gesture had a greater purpose than she could imagine. The following days were a constant race against invisible danger. Alexander trained Emma, discreetly, showing escape routes, hiding important documents, and testing warning signals. The mansion, once silent and oppressive, now seemed like a minefield, where each movement could mean life or death. The servant began to realize something was wrong, and some became secret allies, trusting only the young overweight woman, whose courage had become evident. The tension was palpable in every look, every word exchanged, every step through the silent hallway. Alexander began to trust her, allowing her to know details of the plan that could bring down the entire criminal organization. For the first time, Emma felt not just protected, but essential to both their survival. It was a responsibility that terrified and strengthened at the same time. The danger didn't take long to materialize. One night, gunshots and explosions near the mansion shook the foundations of security that Alexander had built. They needed to act fast. Each decision was crucial. Emma, who before was a silent observer, now became an active participant, guided by the courage that blossomed in her heart. Alexander saw in her not just a forced wife, but an ally, someone capable of facing fear and remaining firm. In the midst of tension, an unexpected connection emerged, where respect and admiration mixed with feelings neither of them dared to name. The enemy was closer than ever, and each miscalculated step could be fatal. But in that instant, Alexander and Emma discovered something greater. Together, they were stronger than any approaching threat. The moment of escape arrived without warning. The mansion, which before seemed imposing and safe, now transformed into a trap. Gunshots echoed to the hallways, alarms went off, and darkness became an accomplice of the enemies. Emma held Alexander's hand firmly, feeling that, for the first time, she wasn't alone in the world. Each step was calculated, each shadow observed with attention. The young overweight woman, who before had been underestimated, showed courage and intelligence, leading the way, helping Alexander dodge dangers and traps. Adrenaline ran through her veins, but along with fear, a feeling of union and trust grew. Each look exchanged between them conveyed more than words could say. It was loyalty, it was care, it was a beginning of love amid chaos. Through the city streets, danger seemed to be on every corner. Suspicious vehicles appeared suddenly, and armed men followed every movement. Alexander taught Emma to hide, to use shortcuts, to trust instincts she didn't know she had before. Each moment of silence carried tension. Each breath was measured. But despite the fear, there was something liberating in that situation. For the first time, Emma and Alexander acted as equal partners, not as forced husband and wife. The young, overweight woman became essential to both their survival, and Alexander, who always controlled everything, began to depend on her. The chaos transformed into connection, and the escape into proof that together they could face any obstacle. It was the kind of experience that changes people forever, creating bonds that neither time nor danger can break. In the middle of the chase, explosions tore through the air and enemy vehicles were destroyed in risky maneuvers. Alexander and Emma needed to trust each other blindly, each decision being vital to not succumb. In a moment of pause, hidden in a dark alley, they exchanged long, silent looks. There was no longer need for words. Trust and loyalty had become their strongest bond. Emma realized that the forced marriage, which before seemed only a prison, had now transformed into something completely different. An alliance of survival, courage, and, without them realizing it, a deep feeling began to blossom. The world was against them, but together, Alexander and Emma learned that the strength of the heart and loyalty surpasses even the cruelest of enemies. The final battle began when Alexander and Emma delivered irrefutable evidence against the criminal empire to the authorities. The tension was palpable. Each step could be the last. Each second could decide life or death. Explosions in the distance shook buildings. Gunshots echoed through the city, and adrenaline kept them alert, united like never before. Alexander guided Emma through alleys and escape routes, protecting her with reflexes that only experience could teach. The young, overweight woman felt fear, but also a growing strength, because she knew they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Each document delivered, each witness protected, meant the destruction of decades of impunity and terror. Alexander, who had always been a symbol of coldness, now showed vulnerability by saving those he loved, proving that true courage requires sacrifice. At the height of the confrontation, Alexander was seriously wounded while protecting Emma from an ambush planned by the Mafia in desperation. He fell, his body struck, and the world seemed to slow down around her. Emma ran to him, holding him in her arms, feeling each beat of his heart as if it were her own life. Adrenaline gave way to fear, and her mind began to register each detail as if freezing time. Alexander looked at her, with eyes full of pain and something deeper, gratitude, trust, and a love that didn't need words. There, in that instant, the young, overweight woman understood that there was no contract, deal, or obligation that could measure what they felt. The forced marriage had transformed into true partnership, and both their courage had opened the way for justice and for an unexpected love. When the dust settled and the last enemies were arrested or fled, Alexander and Emma stood face to face, exhausted, but alive. He was wounded, but breathing, and she, holding his hand, felt a wave of relief and hope. The city, still tense, began to feel the effects of the criminal empire's fall. Each sacrifice made, each risk faced, now had meaning. Alexander smiled, for the first time without disguises, and thanked Emma for her courage and loyalty. She, in silence, realized that the story that began with contempt and fear had transformed into something greater. Redemption, victory, and the beginning of a new chapter for both. They had faced death, fear, and betrayal, and came out stronger, united by an unbreakable bond that life itself had forged. Months passed since the Mafia's fall, and the mansion that once seemed like a prison now breathed an air of hope and tranquility. Alexander was recovered, still with scars that reminded him of each risk faced, but with a genuine smile on his face, something no one had seen in years. Emma visited him every day at the hospital, bringing small flowers, neighborhood stories, and laughter that filled the environment. The young, overweight woman, who one day was despised and humiliated, was now the light that illuminated that powerful man. Each gesture of hers showed courage, empathy, and determination, and Alexander realized that, without her, none of this would have been possible. The love that was born from chaos and silent struggle blossomed slowly, but with strength, showing that life can restart even in the most unexpected places. Their routine now was made of small victories. Long conversations, shared laughter, and simple moments became more valuable than any material wealth. Alexander, once distant and cold, learned to open up, to trust, and to value Emma's courage, who became not just a wife, but a life partner, friend, and confidant. The young, overweight woman discovered that the forced marriage that seemed like punishment had transformed into a story of overcoming, complicity, and genuine love. Each look exchanged carried gratitude. Each silent touch transmitted security. They learned that past traumas don't define the future, and that courage, empathy, and loyalty can transform even the most unlikely relationships into something true. Walking to the mansion's garden, now full of flowers cultivated by Emma, Alexander held her hand firmly and looked into her eyes. The world, once threatening and full of dangers, now seemed smaller before the strength they built together. The enemies were defeated. The threats disappeared, and fear gave way to hope. The young, overweight woman, who one day was humiliated and treated with contempt, was now the protagonist of a new story of love, redemption, and courage. And Alexander, who carried so many secrets and fears, could finally live free, beside the woman who transformed a forced marriage into a real story of love, trust, and overcoming. They knew the future would still bring challenges, but now they had something they would never lose, the certainty that, together, they could face anything. This story of Emma and Alexander shows us something we often ignore. Life can put enormous obstacles in our path, but courage, empathy, and loyalty have the power to transform even the darkest scenarios. How many times have you felt trapped in situations that seemed impossible to change? What if I told you that it's precisely in those moments that the most valuable opportunities for growth and overcoming are born? Observe how the young, overweight woman transformed contempt into strength, loneliness into connection, and fear into action. Each one of us can apply this lesson, recognizing that challenges aren't just barriers, but doors to personal evolution. Now reflect. Have you faced your own Alexanders and fears, or have you let fear dictate your choices? What can you do today to transform adverse situations into learning and personal victory? What can we learn from the courage of someone who, even being underestimated, found within themselves the strength to change their destiny and that of others around them? Exciting stories like this don't exist just to be told. They exist to inspire action, to show that change begins when we decide to face the impossible, and that sometimes the strength we need is within us, waiting to be awakened. If this story touched you and you want to continue learning powerful lessons about courage, overcoming, and emotional intelligence, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Each video brings real stories, challenges, and teachings that can change the way you see your own life. Share in the comments which lesson impacted you most and how you plan to apply it in your daily life. Remember, the power to transform your story is in your hands, and each decision can be the first step toward a new beginning, just like it happened with Emma and Alexander.